In today's video, we will be delving into a particularly dark and disturbing case of a haunting in the early 90s of Illinois. This case, however, is slightly more concerning than most. The victim, Cindy Sarro, has stated that while these occurrences were taking place, she was consistently exposed to extreme violence by an invisible threat that had taken up residence in her new home. Today, we will be covering Cindy's story in full in a special documentary concerning the creepy occurrences and dangerous happenings that allegedly took place on and around Cannonball Hill, where Cindy and her family would find themselves enduring the most terrifying months of their lives. Without further ado, hit the lights, sit back and enjoy as we investigate the bizarre and horrifying case of Cindy Sarro and the haunting of the house on the hill. Background. The year in 1991, and Cindy Sarro, a stay-at-home mother of 2 daughters, is coming to the end of her 2-year residence in her family's duplex in Belleville, Illinois, a town not too far from the city of St. Louis. With Christy and Brooke, age 7 and 9 respectively, continuing to grow up, Cindy figured it would be a good idea to move somewhere with more space. Her long-term boyfriend of 10 years, Glenn, is also eager to make the move. One of Cindy's top priorities is to find a house in close proximity to her mother's, starting the search in and around Caseyville, Illinois. Within a few minutes' drive of her is a good place for them to start the search. The search takes several months before the families start to find suitable houses. During this time, the first eerie signs of the horror that is to come start to creep their way into Cindy's day-to-day life. When Cindy went to bed for the night, she would begin to have the same terrible, recurring nightmare. In these twisted dreams, Cindy would see herself standing in the dark before a very specific staircase, the same old, wooden one each time. Shortly after the dream began, Cindy would start to walk up the staircase, only for a mysterious figure to begin following her. This gave way to a fast-paced chase up the staircase, but Cindy could never see her pursuer. Even if she tried to turn around and look at who or what was chasing her up the stairs in these dreams, she could only see shadows in her peripheral vision. Understandably, these dreams would cause Cindy to jolt awake when she reached the top of the stairs, her heart pounding and her breaths shallow and quick. It was only when Cindy and Glenn signed for a house that the nightmares finally began to come to a close. It seemed like a perfect choice, quiet and secluded, in the open woodlands surrounding Cannonball Hill. The house was a short drive to the nearby town of Caseyville and an even shorter drive to Cindy's mother's house. It would need some work, but it seemed to tick all the boxes. A bigger house in a beautiful natural area where the family could, theoretically, live a peaceful life. As we are about to find out, this would be far from the case. Moving in and early occurrences. Months pass, paperwork is signed, and Cindy and Glenn receive the keys to their very own home. The couple load up their possessions and move them from their old duplex in Belleville to the secluded new house on the hill, eager to start their new lives. As soon as they pulled up into the driveway and walked up the path to unlock the front door, that the problems started to arise. As Glenn approached, he could see hundreds, if not thousands, of wasps swarming the front door. Thick clouds of insects covered the door handle, front windows and porch of the property, to the point where it would have been impossible to enter the building without finding yourself covered in painful stings. As such, the family had to make adjustments to the garden, removing flowers and bushes that would have attracted the wasps, as well as destroying wasps' nests and repeatedly blasting the area with enough bug spray to deal with the swarms. Eventually, the family were able to enter the property and began to investigate the building. Cindy unlocked the windows on the ground floor to let some air into the house, but to her surprise, they would not budge. Even when there was nothing stopping them from opening, they stayed firmly shut. It was then, already unsettled, that Cindy noticed something that made her stop in her tracks. The staircase leading up to the first floor of the house was allegedly the exact same one from her terrible nightmares. The same one she had been repeatedly chased up, terrified by an unseen assailant. This seemingly impossible connection made her heart race, and to take her mind of it, she continued to move her belongings into the new house in boxes. Surely, it would just be a coincidence? The following day, after the house begins to gain some semblance of a furnished home, the family can focus on smaller tasks. Glenn starts by attempting to set up the air conditioning, while Cindy unpacks more boxes after telling her children to take a bath. The children have been upstairs less than 5 minutes before Cindy begins to hear them scream from the first floor. Panicked, Cindy runs upstairs to investigate and sees a thick, black, oil-like substance pouring out of the bath tap where water should have been. Later, Cindy would also see that her washing machine produced the same liquid, staining her clothes jet black. Deciding to make the moving process easier for her children, Cindy drives them down the road to her mother's house, where they spend the night. After dropping them off and returning to the new property, Cindy is alarmed to experience the first textbook signs of a haunting. As she enters the kitchen to unpack her utensils and appliances, her cabinet doors allegedly began to fall off the hinges, one by one, as if by themselves. Every time this happened, the lights throughout the house would flicker, as if the two occurrences were connected. This alarmed Cindy, but at this stage, it was still possible to chalk everything up to a rickety old house and several sleepless nights. The next day, however, when the children returned to the house, they would experience the same flickering lights in their room. They would also become uncontrollably upset when this happened and refuse to enter their bedroom alone. Cindy's true terror began that night. As Glenn worked nights, Cindy decided to sleep on the sofa so the two of them could get a full night's sleep. After 2 hours of sleep, Cindy was forced awake by the sensation of somebody grabbing her eyelashes and pulling hard. Startled and reeling from the sharp burst of pain, Cindy looked around the room frantically but saw nothing or nobody who could have touched her. After sweeping the house for intruders or unlocked doors, she returned to the sofa and closed her eyes, this time covering her face with her forearm in case anything happened again. To Cindy's dismay, she was reportedly punched in the side of the head with full force a few hours after returning to sleep. Again, she shot up and scanned the room, but there was nobody there. This was the beginning of a series of events that would temporarily ruin Cindy's life, a circle of invisible violence, mind games, and sheer terror. These sensations in the middle of the night would continue for weeks and would progress to more aggressive attacks that Cindy would feel across her body. Whenever she felt an attack from this unseen presence, her eyes would always drift, seemingly subconsciously, to one blank wall in the living room as though something was lurking within it. The occurrences continue. A few days later, and Cindy and Glenn have almost finished moving their possessions into the new house. The children have started school, and Glenn spends his evenings at work, leaving Cindy with a lot of time to herself in the new house. It was around this time that Cindy felt a strange sensation for the first time of many, the feeling of effectively leaving her body, or projection, as she has described it. Cindy was faced with an out-of-body experience where she could move freely throughout the house and, as the occurrences went on, see things that were not normally there. The first time this happened, Cindy felt the same presence she had met whilst sleeping kick her very hard in the back, causing immense pain. This caused her to leap back into her body, where she promptly felt the sensation of being punched in the stomach. Cindy phoned her mother to tell her what had happened, who attempted to convince her that these sensations were in her head. She would also speak to Glenn about this, who laughed the occurrences off, joking that she experiences hauntings wherever she lives. This, however, was different, and Cindy tried to stress that. To put her mind at ease, Cindy called for an electrician to investigate the flickering lights throughout the house. Upon examining the light switches, he was reportedly alarmed to see sparks flying out at him when he took the plastic covering off. Even more alarming was that the fuse box looked to have been intentionally tampered with. This was impossible, Cindy told him, as she was certain that only her and her family had been in the house since it was purchased, and the flickering lights only became a problem after several days. Shortly after the electrician's visit, Cindy would start to experience difficulties with the house's telephones and televisions. They would stop working intermittently, and the televisions would come on themselves. Several further occurrences would cause Cindy and Glenn to argue. Unsettled in their new home, Cindy suggested that the family should move before they get too invested in the new property, but Glenn was insistent that they stay. Very few of these initial occurrences seemed to faze him, even when Cindy's family began to experience them too. When her cousins came to see the new house, they would complain of intense headaches, sometimes dropping to the floor in tears as a result. Her younger nieces and nephews told her that they could feel horrible, cold presences in certain rooms, and eventually would refuse to spend time in the house entirely. Around here, the family adopted a puppy who would periodically stop in his tracks and stare at seemingly nondescript locations in the house as though something was present that only he could see. The beginnings of extreme violence. From here, everything seemed to descend into one huge nightmare for Cindy and her family. The worst horrors would seem to creep their way into Cindy's subconsciousness at nighttime. One evening, when she slept on the sofa, she describes the sensation of being brutally beaten by the presence occupying her living room wall. Repeatedly, the entity strikes her with fists that feel very real and frighteningly strong, but no marks are left on her body after. She begs and prays for the entity to stop the assault, but it carries on for several minutes before becoming unbearable. Eventually, through her tears and screams, Cindy hears the faint whisper of a man saying it's evil, at which point the beating recedes. This would spark weeks of sleepless nights for Cindy, who, understandably, was too afraid to close her eyes and rest, out of fear that whatever was beating her up in her sleep would return again. Cindy would spend her evenings in front of the television, on edge that something would happen to her if she drifted off to sleep. This would eventually lead to much mental anguish, alongside the physical beatings she would receive when tiredness got the better of her. Shortly after Cindy is beaten in her sleep, the entity in the wall seems to reveal more of its alleged powers: possession. One afternoon, while Cindy is running errands in the house, she hears Glenn calling her from the next room. Normally, she would respond immediately, but this time, his voice does not appear to be his own. It sounds distorted, as though somebody is attempting a poor impression of her partner. Eventually, Cindy investigates, and what happens next would affect her relationship with her partner forever. Glenn, seemingly under the influence of the presence in the house, attempted to suffocate Cindy with a pillow. Cindy reacts by kicking and struggling to break free of Glenn's grasp and is eventually able to escape. She bolted out of the front door and headed to her mother's house, but did not tell her what happened. The next day, she would return to the house and confront Glenn about the incident, but Glenn would be his usual self. He reportedly had absolutely no recollection of it. Christy and Brooke, Cindy's young daughters, would soon come face to face with these same possessive powers allegedly utilized by the entity in the house. Not long after moving in, they had begun playing with a boy called Sean, who lived in a mobile home down the road from Cannonball Hill. Cindy recalls an incident when the girls were playing with him in the woods outside the house. which ended in Christy running to Cindy in tears to tell her Sean claimed he was going to nail their mother to the wall at midnight. Cindy confronted Sean to find out why he had said this. He told her he had no idea why he said it. Another incident involved Glenn fixing the roof of the house while the girls played with Sean outside within his earshot. He picked up on Sean telling the girls he was going to split Glenn's head open. Glenn climbed down from the roof and confronted the boy, who simply repeated himself, telling Glenn to his face that he intended to split his head open. From this point, Cindy and Glenn told Sean to stay away from the house and their daughters. Soon after, the alleged spirit in the wall would make its first and only physical appearance to Cindy, who claims to have confronted it after being attacked in her sleep again one night. As she received a routine physical beating from the unseen assailant, Cindy's fear switched to anger, and she demanded to be able to see her attacker, telling it that it was unfair that it could see her, but she had no idea where or what this being was. After waking up again, she sees a young boy in the room standing next to the wall. This was not a boy she recognized from the neighborhood or surrounding area. He wore a beanie hat, a vest, khaki-colored trousers, and formal shoes that would usually be worn by a little girl. Cindy says that she felt as though this boy was beckoning her to join him, or that he was calling out for her for some unknown reason. Cindy felt immensely drained after witnessing what she believed to be the entity in the wall, and drifted off to sleep easily. After meeting with the spirit, Cindy's nightly beatings from the spirit would seem to get worse, as did the arguments between her and Glenn. The couple would constantly be at each other's throats, to the point where Cindy felt it would be best for her and Glenn to spend some time apart. After one particularly bad argument, Cindy called Glenn's mother to convince him to stay with her for a while. He did, and for a few days, Cindy was able to get some respite from the fighting. That is, until one evening when she saw Glenn approaching to front door out of the living room window. He had seemingly walked up to the house in the middle of the night, uninvited, and as he stepped into the light, Cindy could see that he was carrying an axe. To her utter terror, Glenn began attempting to chop the door down, swinging repeatedly with the blade in a manner reminiscent of The Shining. Glenn was showing the same disembodied look from the day he had tried to suffocate Cindy with the pillow. He may have been under the influence of the spirit in the wall yet again. When it was clear that Glenn would not respond to her, she called the police, who promptly drove to the house and arrested him before he could get inside. Cindy did not press charges, believing that it was the spirit and not Glenn who was to blame for the incident. Terrifying mind games. After it became clear that Glenn did not have control over his own body when he approached the house with an axe, Cindy decided to take another chance with him, letting him move back in. Their relationship steadily began to improve, and Cindy even began working at a local hotel in Caseyville alongside her friend to gain some extra money in case she found herself living without Glenn again in the future. While these aspects of her life started to steadily improve, the hauntings in her home began to take a different turn. The creepy events she experienced would become more psychological, playing games with her mind and sanity to make things as difficult as possible for her during her waking hours. Cindy describes one such night when she got up to use the bathroom in the early hours of the morning. She turned on the bathroom light, looking in the mirror when washing her hands, only to be met with the terrifying gaze of a hag staring back at her where her reflection should have been. She screamed and bolted for the bathroom door, turning the light off as she went. Each of these actions were reportedly copied by the spirit, and she could feel something else forcing the hanging light switch down as she pulled it. Another occurrence that happened around this time involved another apparition, but one that was very different to that of the young boy Cindy assumed had been orchestrating the haunting. While working on the house, Glenn had removed an old, tattered American flag hanging on one wall in the living room that was there before they moved in. That night, an apparition of an old Civil War soldier dressed for battle materialized out of the wall where the flag once hung. He did not say anything or harm her, but Cindy was terrified by his presence nonetheless. She suggested to Glenn that he hung the American flag back on the wall. He did, and the soldier did not reappear. The historical nature of this apparition led Cindy to discussing the site of her new home with her uncle, a history enthusiast with an interest in the Civil War. It was at this point that Cindy discovered Cannonball Hill's historical significance. Civil War battles were fought where her house now stood, with many soldiers buried across the site. The apparition of a soldier cited by Cindy may have been that of an individual who fought in the Civil War and is perhaps buried beneath the hill. The mind games continued despite Cindy's newfound knowledge. Cindy would suffer another out-of-body experience that would see her exploring an alternate version of her house, one that had been converted into a dreamlike laboratory. As her mind explored the rooms of the house, she would encounter men in protective clothing examining different colored liquid in test tubes. Whenever Cindy attempted to become conscious and return to her body in these scenarios, the spirit would lash out at her, preventing her from returning. If she did manage to return, it caused her immense pain, and she has even stated that she would feel her bones crack as she attempted to return to the real world. Cindy would also notice a change in the family dog. He would become more erratic and nervous, barking at blank spaces in the house. One night in particular, Cindy would see the dog stare at her with unsettling, bright green eyes. The dog's food and water was stored in the garage outside. Cindy describes how one morning she went to feed the dog, and the 5-gallon tank of water stored in the garage had been moved across the room, with not a drop of water spilt. As she walked back to the house, she would see huge footprints, human-like, but not quite human, embedded in the soil around the hill. Now, at this point in the story, anybody would agree that the claims made in this haunting are outlandish, albeit terrifying. Cindy began to worry that nobody would believe her tale and turned to her religion for solace. Before she went to sleep each night, she would turn to Jesus, praying to him to keep her safe throughout the evening. To her relief, the beatings seemed to stop for a while, and Cindy could catch up on some of the sleep she had lost since moving into the house. Unfortunately, the spirit seemed to ramp up the aggression it was showing in the daytime in the days following this. As she walked around the house, Cindy would claim to see pink smoke emanating from the walls of the house, which would progressively worsen into huge clouds of pink energy. Terrified, Cindy would attempt to jump out of the house's window, in fear that the smoke would harm her. When she began to jump, the smoke reportedly retreated, and Christy, Cindy's daughter, would enter the room with the same vacant, contorted look on her face Glenn had when he was attempting to chop the door down. On one occasion, Christy would stare at Cindy with angry, dead eyes, simply saying, "I know what you did, and I hate you," in an eerie, uncanny voice, leaving the house. Everything described to date in this video reportedly took place within just 2 months after moving. Around this time, Cindy would tell Glenn she is intent on leaving the house for good. That morning, she takes the children to school and leaves on a bus for work. After her shift, she drives to stay with her mother, insisting that Glenn stays away again in case the spirit has attached itself to him once more. This continues for a few days, up to the point where Cindy realizes she needs some clean clothes for herself and the children, all of which are in the house on Cannonball Hill. She attempts to retrieve new clothes from the house with her uncle in tow, telling him to pray the entire time he is in there to stop the entity from attacking. Her uncle admitted that he was not praying when inside the house, and they are met with the same flickering lights and television that has previously indicated the spirit being near. Cindy was able to retrieve some clothes and return to her mother's. This would not be the only time Cindy needed to return to the house for supplies. On another occasion, she describes being followed through the house by a terrible smell before being grabbed by the throat and thrown to the ground by the spirit. These events led to Cindy falling into a deep depression, and she spent nearly all of the time that followed at her mother's. Cindy then decided to contact local priests, explaining her situation in full and requesting that they visit the house to help her cleanse the property of evil. Many priests seem to be making excuses to not help her, but one eventually agrees, but only if Cindy undergoes a psychiatric evaluation to prove that she is not under the influence of alcohol or drugs. She passed this evaluation, and the priest soon agrees to visit her in a few weeks to see what he can do. Between this initial conversation with the priest and his ultimate visit to the property, Cindy experiences the most terrifying out-of-body experience she would suffer while she owned the property on Cannonball Hill. One night at her mother's house, she would leave her body once more and see her mother's house as it might have looked in the 1920s. Old-fashioned clothing was hung up in the cupboards, and the kitchen was filled with cans of food printed with old logos. Suddenly, Cindy felt herself warp to the house on the hill, and she immediately begins to panic. Still out of her own body, she begins to see mysterious men in black cloaks gather around what looked like a basic crate-like coffin in the woods outside her home. She could make out individual faces of these men, yet recognized none of them. As they gather around this wooden coffin, Cindy believes they may be attempting to sacrifice somebody to something, potentially the devil. Eventually, she would return to her body and the men would disappear. It is entirely unknown to Cindy who these people were. Confronting evil. A few weeks after their initial conversation, the investigating priest eventually gets back in touch with Cindy and tells her that he is ready to inspect the house with the help of another from Missouri who specializes in exorcisms. The priests meet Cindy at the house on the hill and sprinkle the entire building with holy water, chanting, "Jesus be with us," as they go. When the priests left, she feels convinced that this did little to cleanse the house of the potential evil spirit in the walls, but wants to give life there another go. At this point, Cindy called Glenn and told him they can move back into the house. It took a matter of minutes before the terrifying occurrences started up once more. As the children returned to the house, Brooke became frozen in her tracks as she attempted walk up the staircase and began to scream. The spirit, it would seem, had a grip on her and was not letting her go. Cindy became furious at this, demanding that the entity let go of her child. Eventually, the spirit relented, and Cindy grabbed her daughters and ran. All the while she was trying to leave, the lights were flickering, accompanied by the sounds of terrible banging coming from the walls. Safe once more at her mother's house, Cindy called the priest, updating him on the ordeal, asking him to return to bless the house once more. The priest refused to help, explicitly stating that he would never return to the house. He seemed to point the blame at Cindy, telling her that she needed to stop leaving her body. Cindy would stop communicating with him from here. At this point, Cindy feels helpless. The only thing left for her to do is put the house back on the market, which she does, after just 3 months of living on Cannonball Hill. She would go on to host an open house for new tenants to view the property before buying it, but only seemed to attract attention from locals who had heard about Cindy's ordeal and wanted to explore an alleged real-life haunted house. At one point during the open house, Cindy was forcefully pushed to the ground by the entity, Whatever was in the house was hell-bent on making Cindy's life as difficult and as unpleasant as possible, and could seemingly not be confronted. Final terrors. Before Cindy was eventually able to rid herself of the house on the hill, a few more creepy occurrences would take place. The first took place when a mysterious black van would park itself in front of her mother's driveway one morning, preventing Cindy from leaving to take the children to school. She approaches to investigate, and a man introducing himself as Daryl steps out, seeming to have suffered a bloody wound to his forehead. He tells Cindy that he knows about the occurrences on the hill, but what he reveals makes her blood run cold. Daryl tells Cindy that the spirit in the house is demanding a sacrifice, and that it specifically wants Cindy. Daryl tells Cindy that if she takes him to the house, he will sacrifice himself in her place. He also tells her to research the killing of a little boy in the house at the local library, which she does later that day, but she finds nothing regarding this in their records. Daryl and his black van disappeared just as Cindy returned inside her mother's house, seemingly in the blink of an eye. A few days later, Cindy's friends ask her if she can give them a tour of the house before she manages to eventually sell it on. She reluctantly agrees and takes a small group of friends over to the house one night to see if they can observe any creepy occurrences. As expected, the walls and doors begin to bang and clatter as people enter, and one friend becomes stuck in a possession-like loop of saying the name Daryl over and over again. They all leave the house immediately. Cindy would go on to investigate Daryl, asking her friends and family if they knew who he was. Her mother would eventually tell her that Cindy's nephew would occasionally hang around with a little boy called Daryl, but he passed away several years ago. It is unknown if Daryl and the spirit of the boy that appeared to Cindy are allegedly the same person. Cindy would only return to the house a couple more times before she eventually managed to sell it, to gather a few belongings while she and Glenn moved into a trailer away from Cannonball Hill. The first time, Cindy's daughter Christy agreed to accompany her, and it is in her room that the horrors show their face once more. As Christy entered her bedroom, she noticed that all of her dolls had been propped up to look at the doorway as she entered, none of which were in the presence of anybody but the family while they owned the property. Cindy claims to have heard voices screaming all around her on this day, while she attempted to gather supplies to take back to the trailer, and quickly took her daughter and ran. Cindy's final trip to the house ended with a visit from a plumber when she entered the front door and saw that the entire ceiling had collapsed, stating to the plumber that she thought a water pipe had broken, but fearing the work of the entity in the walls. The plumber would eventually tell her that he had no explanation. In his words, he told her that it almost looked as if the ceiling had exploded downwards, with no evidence of structural complications that may have caused it. Outro. Leaving Cannonball Hill. Cindy was finally able to sell her dreaded house in the autumn of 1992 and has lived without the horrors of Cannonball Hill since then. To this day, there is no concrete explanation for what she experienced within the walls of that house, but her terrifying experiences have led her to becoming a published author. Her book, The Wall, The Terrifying True Story of a Haunting, is available to purchase now, and her story was later picked up by the media, being adapted into the Discovery Channel's 2007 program, A Haunting. Cindy is now safe and well, and has cut ties with the terrifying house on the hill. This is where our story today ends. What did you think of these reported experiences? And how might you have reacted if faced with such a terrifying scenario? We would love to hear your comments below. Thank you for watching. And don't forget to stay with us throughout the month of October. where we will be bringing you much more creepy content like this.